Good morning, everybody. Today is March 17th, 2025. Today, I wanted to talk about Form 7F. Did you know that compensation is negotiable? I'm sure all of us did. Of course, we did. But did you know that there's a way to offer a varied compensation based on a buyer broker's performance? Today, we're going to talk about and look at the form that lays out how that variable compensation works. And making sure that we fill it out in a way that conveys this to not only the buyer agent, but also in our listing so we can translate that to our purchase and sale agreement. We're going to be talking about how to show the requirements for the performance in the listing, making it clear and concise to the buyer broker when it comes to the actions needed for this variable compensation rate. So there are many reasons a seller may choose to offer a variable rate. One of them could be for high-end properties, like multi-million-dollar properties. It's possible that the seller could want to offer a specific rate up to a certain price point, and then above that price point, offer a different compensation rate. It's also possible that a seller may want to require the buyer broker to be present for things like showings and inspections and make sure the buyer broker is fully performing the duties that they should be. And if not, receive a lesser compensation for not meeting those requirements. In any case, if for any reason your client chooses to use more than just one number with compensation, we're going to pull out Form 7F, the variable compensation form. Now, if there's any case that there has to be this varied compensation, the buyer broker gets paid the amount. We want to make sure that the buyer broker is going to get paid the amount they're anticipating. We want to make sure the seller is paying the amount they are intending to pay. And we want to make sure that there's a way that we clearly convey this to all the brokers involved. We want to make sure that those requirements are bullet pointed very clearly. But most importantly, we want to make sure that it translates to our purchase and sale agreement. So escrow has the instructions on how to do that payout. So let's look at the form. This is Form 7F. It's a pretty small and simple form. First, we're going to go ahead and reference the seller, the listing firm, and the property as we do with most of our other forms. Then reference the listing number. Now, this is typically done before the listing goes live, so you may not have a listing number, or you may have one that's inactive. So go ahead and pop it in there if you have it. And if not, we'll go ahead and reference it later. Next, you're going to want to state clearly the requirements that have to be met in order for the compensation to be paid. So what it says is the seller requests that the buyer broker perform the following tasks in order to receive the full amount from the buyer brokerage firm offered in the listing. This is going to be an action item that's needed to be done so the buyer can receive the full compensation that the seller was offering. If there are varied rates, those need to be explained very clearly in here. Now, what you'll want to do is you'll want to write things like buyer broker to be present for all showings and inspections, or whatever the action is needed from that buyer broker in order to receive that full compensation. Then, if those conditions are not met, the next line is where we need to clearly mark what the compensation offer is should the buyer broker not perform those actions listed above. And then this is only a contract between the listing firm and the seller. So the seller is the only one that does need to sign them. So how do we put this into the listing? We're going to have to make note in our listing agreement and listing input sheet. And that's going to be very difficult because there's not a lot of space. So this is going to be something where you're going to use the other box or buyer broker compensation comment box. You have to disclose if there is a requirement to do this. It has to be put into that box. The 7 will have to be also uploaded as a attached doc to the listing. It needs to be very clear that this action is needed in order to receive that compensation. So none of this can be hidden. If you hide any of this, it will not be able to be enforced. So how does that translate to our purchase and sale agreement? Think about this. We have a variable compensation rate based on performance. The variable rate says the buyer broker is going to receive $10,000, but if the buyer broker doesn't show up for the showing to let the client in the door or doesn't show up to the inspection, then we're going to drop that down to $5,000. So what happens on our purchase and sale agreement when we have an offer of compensation that's not consistent? Well, if the seller's offer of compensation includes those conditions and they're not met, and the purchase and sale agreement lists one number, then the number that's on the purchase and sale agreement is what's being offered. If the same amount that the buyer broker thinks is being offered without conditions is put into this, then that is the number the seller is going to pay. So if the parties agree on the purchase and sale agreement that the seller will pay the buyer broker a specific identified amount, then that amount is owed to that buyer broker regardless of what the conditions were and if they were met. If a seller makes an offer of compensation that's unacceptable to the buyer, you can always counter offer because we know that this is one of those negotiable terms. But if this is for a variable compensation and an action needs to be done in order to do that, and that is not clearly defined in the purchase and sale agreement, then the amount in 17B is going to be the amount of compensation paid regardless of if those conditions were met. Now, you can use the 41C and you can check in the other provision to explain what those terms are for receiving full compensation. There are other forms that we can use in that as well. You can counter offer and put it in a counter offer addendum. You can use a blank 34. But in any case, if the compensation is different than what's being paid in 17B based on performance, an additional form is going to be needed to explain how that works and what conditions need to be met. Now, if a seller wants to retain all of their terms for that conditional offer as part of their purchase and sale agreement, then you can add a Form 34 stating out the requirements that need to be done as well. And then all parties sign this. Remember, the original offer of compensation, even at the variable rate, is an offer of compensation that's decided only between the listing firm and the seller. So think of it like a listing agreement. And then this one right here, the Form 34, if spelled out on this one, would be the agreed upon for the purchase and sale agreement. As we know, being fully negotiable throughout the contract, throughout the listing agreement, whatever is in the contract is what is going to happen. Make sure to include all of the terms for that conditional compensation if that's what you're working with. If there's a difference between what's offered, make sure that you are putting something very clear and that you're identifying it either on Form 34, on a counter offer, somewhere in the purchase and sale agreement that is the case. You will need to be instructing escrow on how to pay that out. Typically, when I've done these variable compensations, mine are conditioned upon something that happens before the purchase and sale goes into effect. So I have had it to where if the buyer broker doesn't show their client the home and instead has the listing broker show the home on behalf of them, the variable compensation would be different than the one offered should that buyer broker be the one to tour them from start to finish. That being done ahead of time, it's a lot more clear and concise what the compensation offer is because it's been laid out in what the 7F shows. It's been attached to the listing. It's in the agent remarks. And now with our new form having that compensation negotiation space, that number can go in 17B and also be very clear so nothing further is needed. If there is a difference in compensation offered in the purchase and sale agreement versus what's offered in the listing agreement does control. However, we are needing to still make this very clear because we cannot hide offers of compensation if they exist. Our compensation is very negotiable, but needs to be made very clear, very concise. And remember, if you don't have anything stating that compensation is varied and you have a number in 17B, you will be paying the number in 17B as the seller, and you will be receiving that number in 17B as the buyer. So although this can seem a little bit confusing, we just need to make sure that our contracts are as transparent as possible. So there you go, 7F. If you have any questions about how to use this form, how to offer variable compensation, or how to do any input, please reach out to your managing broker and we will be happy to walk you through this.